river crossing drowning by the season, a man too proud to write the word beg, and a keeper who was not a keeper the way he meant it at all. She stepped off the down freight at Sundown Crossing with a single sea chest, a gray traveling cloak, and hands that had feathered an oar since before she could read. And the 6 men loafing on the Roadhouse porch agreed among themselves that she would be gone on the next train up. President Bishop had advertised in the Ferristown Clarion for a Roadhouse keeper because his trade was bleeding away to the new bridge downriver and his hired man had quit over the wages. And he had expected a man, wanted a man, and written the notice certain no one else would trouble to answer. What he got was Marguerite Fontaine, a widow out of the old Ferry parishes on the great river below the falls, a woman who had been raised on a rope ferry and could read moving water the way a doctor reads a pulse. President Bishop believed he was hiring somebody to fry eggs and make beds. He was hiring the only person in the whole of Wyoming Territory who could keep his father's ferry alive through the high water, and neither one of them knew it yet. If you have ever been counted small for the very thing you were built to do, tap that like button and drop the name of your river in the comments. I want to see how far this story floats. It was April of 1886 in the high dry sage country of the Sweetwater Basin, where the town of Ferristown sat on a wagon road between the cattle ranges and the railhead, and where, 3 miles above town, a brown ribbon of Snowmelt River cut a canyon through the sage and was crossed, or had been crossed for 20 years, by the Bishop Rope Ferry at a wide place the freighters called Sundown Crossing. The crossing belonged to President Bishop, and the ferry belonged to the crossing, and the mortgage on all of it belonged to the Ferristown branch of the Cattlemen and Drovers Bank, which was the plainest ownership of the 3. The freight came down twice a week. On this Thursday, it brought a keg of nails, a crate of airtights, a roll of newspapers, and a woman nobody had sent for by name. The brakeman handed her down without being asked, which the men on the porch marked, because the brakeman was a surly article who handed down nothing. She stood a moment in the wind, with her cloak pressed flat, and looked at the place she had come 1,100 miles to reach. There was not much of it. A long, low roadhouse of squared logs gone silver with weather, a stable, a wagon yard rutted to the axles, a cold smithy, a plank landing sloping down to the water, and out on the brown river itself a broad, flat ferry boat riding low against a rope that sagged in a long belly from bank to bank. The river ran full and fast and the color of milked coffee with the spring melt, and even from the yard she could hear it, the deep, steady mutter of a river working hard in its banks, and under the mutter something she did not like, a note off true, a wrong music where the current met the ferry rope. She heard that before she looked at the men. The men had come off the porch to look at her, 5 of them in a loose row, dusty freighters, and 1 thick old fellow with a pipe, and a 6th walking up from the landing with his hat pushed back, tall and stooped a little at the shoulder, maybe 42, with the particular stillness of a man waiting for the next piece of bad news to arrive. That one stopped 6 feet from her and looked at the sea chest, and the good cloak, and the gloved hands folded in front of her, and said quiet that there had been some mistake. She said there had not been. He said he had advertised for a roadhouse keeper. She said she knew it, and had answered by letter 3 weeks past, and had his reply in her pocket agreeing to wages of $18 a month and found, and that her name was Mrs. Marguerite Fontaine, and that she had signed the letter M. Fontaine because she had learned twice before what became of letters signed with a woman's Christian name. One of the freighters snorted and swallowed it. President Bishop put his hat straight. He was not an unkind man, and what crossed his face was not unkindness but arithmetic, the fast, unhappy figuring of a man weighing the cost of sending her back against the cost of keeping her on, and finding both sums past his reach. He said this was a hard place, that the wagon crews came through cursing and left the same way, that the last keeper had quit over the loneliness and the one before over the pay, and that a river crossing in the sage was no fit place for a woman alone. She looked past his shoulder at the roadhouse with its sagging gallery and its cold chimney, and asked what he had been taking in of a week, feeding and bedding the wagon trade. He was startled into answering plain. $9, he said, some weeks less, and it had bought food the freighters would as soon throw at the dog. She said she would feed and bed them better on those same $9 and turn the roadhouse a profit inside a month. And if either thing proved false by the 1st of May, he could put her on the up train and owe her nothing. The wind came off the water between them. Down at the landing, the ferry knocked against its guides, and the rope groaned where the current dragged it, and the river ran the color of coffee all the way to the Red Canyon wall, and present Bishop, who could not afford a keeper at any wage and could hold his trade together without one even less, said the words that saved his living without knowing he had said them. He said, "All right." The 1st of May, then, he carried her chest into the roadhouse himself, because whatever else had worn off the man his mother's raising had not. And he grunted at the weight of it and asked what a keeper hauled around that weighed like ballast. "Books," she said, which was true as far as it reached. What the chest held, folded in oilcloth at the bottom under the aprons and the French prayer book, and the one good dark dress, was a mariner's brass compass and a coil of tarred marline and a fid and a marlin spike, and a leather roll of splicing tools, her father's, carried out of the ferry parishes below the falls. The whole toolkit of a woman who could lay up a rope, whip an end, and read a current for its drowned rocks. There was no cause to mention any of it. Nobody had asked her to splice a thing. The roadhouse kitchen was worse than she had feared, and better than she had endured. The range was a great rust-scabbed iron thing with a cracked firebox. The flour had weevils, the coffee was cheap and burned, the bacon was good, and the dried fruit had been bought by a man who had stopped caring. She took off her cloak, hung it on a peg, and had the firebox scraped and the range drawing sweet inside the hour. The wagon crew that had laid over ate that night at 7, and it was only fried salt pork and biscuit and beans and coffee. But the pork was crisped and not swimming, the biscuit stood up light, and the coffee had been measured out honest, and boiled to strength and not to tar. Nobody thanked her. A grizzled freight boss named Duff Hooley ate 3 helpings without a word and got up, and at the door he stopped and told the wall that the last keeper never once got the biscuit to raise. It was not a welcome. It was a weather report. But she had lived her whole life among men who worked with their backs, and she knew a door when she heard it come open an inch. She scrubbed the plates, banked the range, and before she slept, she did the one thing she had been aching to do since the freight set her down. She took a lantern down to the landing in the dark, and she walked out onto the ferry deck, and she laid her bare hand flat on the great rope where it came in over the sheave, and she read the river through it the way her father had taught her to read a rope before she could spell her own name. The rope was hemp, and it was old, and it was wrong. It had been served over in one worn place with light marline that had itself gone rotten. It was set at a bad angle to the current, so the river fought it broadside the whole crossing instead of being let to do the ferry's work. And where it dipped to the water at midstream, the strands had begun to open like a tired mouth. She followed the rope with her hand and her ear and her lantern to the great cottonwood snubbing post on the near bank, and found the post half rotted at the ground line and leaning, held by habit, and by the mercy of God, and by nothing a sober rope maker would trust a mule to, let alone a loaded wagon and a team over deep, fast snowmelt. She stood in the dark on the knocking deck with the cold coming up off the water and the whole brown weight of the spring river sliding past under her boots. And she understood two things at once, and clean. The first was that this crossing was dying, and not from the bridge downriver, because the bridge was 10 miles down a bad road and charged double, and half the freighters hated it. It was dying from neglect, from a rope and a post and a boat that no one on the place knew how to keep, and it could be saved by anyone who knew what she knew. The second was that no one here would believe her, not yet, maybe not ever, because she had watched the arithmetic run behind the man's eyes on the porch. She was the keeper. She had fought that reckoning in 2 countries and lost every round but one. So Marguerite Fontaine walked her lantern back up the landing and went to bed, and if she lay a while listening to the river work at its rotten rope in the dark, she was up before any man on the place, regardless, and the coffee was hot before first light. She had promised them the 1st of May. There was a great deal a patient woman could learn about a river crossing before the 1st of May, and she meant to learn all of it. The true shape of the trouble came to her the way trouble always comes to a cook, through the food and the talk over it. A wagon crew eats twice and drinks between, and a woman who keeps her hands busy and her mouth shut will hear a crossing confess itself whole inside a fortnight. The Bishop Ferry had been laid across the Sweetwater in 1866 by Elihu Bishop, Present's father, back when the road to the mines at Gilt Edge was the only road there was, and every ounce of freight for 3 ranges crossed at sundown or crossed nowhere. In the fat years, the crossing had run day and night. A wagon on the water and 3 in the yard waiting, the roadhouse full every night. Elihu talking of a second ferry and a real bridge of his own and a proper town, and the road agents of 2 counties tipping their hats to him. Then Elihu was thrown from a green horse and died slow of it over a hard winter, and the mines at Gilt Edge began their long petering out, and the freight that had run day and night ran twice a week. And 2 years back a Denver company had thrown a toll bridge across the river 10 miles down at the Ferristown Narrows, iron-cabled and all-weather, and had begun the patient business of strangling every rope ferry above it. That bridge was the shadow over everything. It charged $1.25 to the ferry's 75 cents, and it was ugly and out of the way, and half the old freighters would sooner ford a horse than give it their money. But it did not sink, and it did not close at high water, and a rope ferry that could not be trusted at high water was a ferry sliding toward the day it carried nobody at all. And the ferry could not be trusted at high water. She learned that from Ambrose Teal, the old pipe smoker, who tended the near landing and could not keep a thing behind his teeth, and who told her over pie that the ferry had not run a loaded wagon across in flood since the spring before last, when a freighter's team had gone off the low end into the current and near drowned. And Present had lost his nerve for it and shut the crossing to heavy loads any day the river ran high, which in the melt season was most days, and every one of those days the wagons went grumbling the 10 miles down to the toll bridge and left their supper money there instead of here. She learned the rest from the ledger, because Present Bishop did his accounts at the Roadhouse table on Sunday nights after the crews had turned in, for the lamp and the warmth and, though he would never have said it, the company. He did not hide the book from her. It did not enter his head that a keeper could read a ledger, and it certainly did not enter his head that she would read it upside down from the far end of the table while she mended, which she did every Sunday, entry by entry, the whole cold spring. What the ledger said was this: the crossing owed the Cattlemen and Drovers Bank $900, the last of the money Elihu had borrowed to build the second landing, and Present had borrowed to bury him, and the note came due the 1st of October, and Simon Record at the bank had carried it over twice, and had written in a fine hand that he could not in conscience carry it a third time. The crossing took in 75 cents a wagon and a dime a horse, and its roadhouse trade on top. And against that stood the taxes and the flour and the lamp oil and old Teal's wages. And the arithmetic came out a little short every single month. A slow leak. A boat taking water faster than one tired man could bail. And the leak was widening, because every wagon turned away at high water was a wagon that learned the road to the bridge, and some of them did not trouble to come back. A child could read the direction of it. The Bishop Crossing was a man standing in a rising river with the water at his belt, not drowning yet, but not able to say the hour when the water would reach his chin. And October was a long way up the bank, and there was the girl. Cordelia Bishop, called Delia, was 10 that spring, a thin, quick, gray-eyed child who did not go to the school in Ferristown, because the crossing could not spare a horse and a half day to carry her in and out, and because since her mother died she would not be anywhere her father was not. Susanna Bishop had died of childbed fever 2 winters past, she and the baby both in 1 week, and it had gone through the crossing like a snapped cable through a windlass. The men would talk to Marguerite about the bridge, about the bank, about record and the note and the high water. But not one of them would speak Susanna's name where Present could hear it. And Present did not speak it at all. The child spoke it, once, to Marguerite, in the 3rd week. Sitting on the kitchen step stringing the beans Marguerite had paid her a penny to string. She said her mother used to sing while she worked the dough, and looked sideways with her whole small body braced, the way a child throws a thing it is afraid will break. Marguerite said, without slowing her hands, that a woman who sang over her dough had known her business, and that the child might teach her the song if she liked, for Marguerite's own mother had sung over the ferry rope on the great river, and she had a hunger for the old tunes out here in the dry. And the child let out a breath she had been holding 2 years, and sang it small and off-key, a French rowing song Marguerite had not heard since her mother's grave, and after that the girl was hers. It was the first thing she mended at Sundown Crossing, and no soul saw her do it, which was how she chose to work. The men came next, plate by plate. She fed them on $9 a week as promised, and fed them better than they had eaten on that road in years, because she bought like a woman who had been poor in 2 languages. She saved every scrap of drippings, set a sourdough crock going the 1st week, made the burnt cheap coffee drinkable by roasting the green beans herself in the oven, bought the cracked and the bruised that the Ferristown store could not sell and let go for pennies, salted down a barrel of the trout the canyon gave up in the eddies below the landing, and when Duff Hooley found dried apple pandody on the table on a plain gray Tuesday, for no reason on earth, the last grumbling in the wagon yard died of it. By the 1st of May, not one freighter on that road would have put her on the up train for any wage, and Present Bishop paid her the $18 without a word about the arrangement ending, and she took it the same way, and that was the whole of the bargain. She was the keeper now. She saw the town for the first time in the middle of May, riding in on a hired mule to do the month's buying herself, because a keeper who lets other hands do her buying has surrendered her $9 before she starts. Ferristown was one long street of false fronts, with the bank at the head of it like a stiff-collared uncle, and it took the measure of a stranger woman with a bluntness the old parishes would have crossed themselves at. The women on the walk priced her cloak, her boots, and her ringless glove in 1 pass each, totted up the whole of her, and moved along. In the mercantile she met the storekeeper's wife, Hannah Loy, across a counter for the first time, and the 2 of them conducted 20 minutes of hard trading over cracked wheat, condemned dried fruit, and a barrel of freight stove airtights, at the end of which each had privately decided the other was the first sensible creature she had met in the county, though neither said so for a year and more. And on the walk outside, a big smooth man in a fine drab coat stepped square into her path, swept off his hat, and named himself Josiah Vane, of the Ferristown Bridge and Transfer Company, an old friend of the crossing, an old friend of Mr. Elihu Bishop, God rest him, and said with a wide, warm smile that he hoped the new keeper would find her place everything she wished, and that if ever she or the crossing wanted anything freighted, forwarded, or carried, she had only to send word to his office, for near everything that moved in that country moved through his hands one way or another. He took her hand as though he meant to keep it, and he smelled of bay rum and money, and his eyes made the same slow pass over her the town women's had. Only he was not pricing her cloak. He was pricing her use, and Marguerite thanked him in her careful English and drew her hand back, and could not for the life of her have told you that day why the warmth of that handshake clung to her glove like something spilled. She was a long way from any charge. It was only that she had been reading currents since she was a child, and the instrument in her wrist registered, faint, that the friendliest man in Ferristown had felt for half a second like a slack rope suddenly gone taut, a line with a strain on it from somewhere she could not yet see. She noticed, too, without seeming to, that he had asked her 3 careful questions in the guise of pleasantry. How the crossing was faring, whether present meant to keep the ferry running through the melt, whether the Roadhouse still turned a trade, and that each answer he received seemed to please him in a way that had nothing warm in it, the way a fisherman is pleased to feel a line go slack that ought to be taut. She gave him nothing but weather and thanks, and walked on to load her mule and put the handshake out of her mind, or meant to, and could not quite, and let it lie there like a stone in a boot she would deal with when she had time to sit down, which meant she could begin. She began at the rope, in the gray hour before the crews stirred, when only the river was awake. She had her father's tools out of the oilcloth at last, and she went over the ferry rope hand over hand from the near post to the far, standing on the deck as she hauled the boat across empty on its pulleys, feeling every fathom of it the way a blind woman reads a face. What she found would have made her father sit down on the bank and put his head in his hands. The rope was hemp where the great river ferries had gone to wire cable 20 years back, and hemp will serve if it is minded. But this had not been minded. It was set on a dead level between 2 posts, so the river struck the broad boat full on the side, and the crossing was a fight the whole way. When a ferry rope hung properly high on the upstream bank and low on the down, lets the current itself swing the angled boat across for nothing, the way a kite ferries on its string. The oldest trick her people knew, and the one Elihu Bishop had never learned because he had figured it all out himself, alone, out of nothing, magnificently, and half wrong. The snubbing posts were rotten. The traveler blocks that ran the boat along the rope were worn oval, and one was cracked. The serving over the worn midstream spot was gone to punk, and the boat itself sat wrong in the water, trimmed by the stern so its low bow shipped the river on any crossing that was not dead calm, which was exactly why a team had gone off it into the flood 2 springs back, and exactly why present Bishop no longer dared it at high water. There was nothing wrong with Sundown Crossing that a river parish ferryman would not have set right in a fortnight, and nothing wrong that these men, working the best natural crossing for 20 miles, could see at all, because they had learned the ferry from Elihu Bishop, who had learned it from no one. She said none of this for 6 weeks. She was a woman who had twice in her life spoken her trade too soon among men who did not know her. once at a Missouri boatyard and once at a Kansas crossing, and both times it had cost her the roof over her head. She cooked and mended and paid the girl pennies to string beans and listened and set down small figures in a small book of her own. And on a Sunday evening in the middle of June, while President Bishop sat frowning over the tax notice at her scrubbed table, she set his coffee down and asked, in the same voice she would have used about the weather, why the ferry rope was hung level from bank to bank instead of high on the upstream side. He looked up at her. It was the first question anyone had asked him about the working of the ferry rather than the money of it since his father died. He said, slow, that his father had hung it level so the boat rode even, and asked why a keeper wanted to know about ferry ropes. And Marguerite Fontaine looked at the ledger, and the tax notice, and the tired, proud man behind them both, and decided the mending would not keep for a kinder season, and said that a level rope made the river the ferry's enemy, and that a rope hung high upstream and low downstream made the river the ferry's horse, and that if he would give her one still Sunday, and the loan of 2 men, she would show him on the water why his crossing shut down every day the river rose, and how to open it again. The landing went very quiet in her memory ever after, though it was only the 2 of them and the girl pretending to sleep by the range. President Bishop shut the ledger and gave her the look men had been giving her all her life, and she watched him near say the whole of it, that she was the keeper, that the river was men's work, that his father had strung that rope with his own hands. What he said instead, after a long moment, God keep him for it always, was that he could not risk the boat, that the boat was all he had. It was not a yes. But it was not the up train either, and she had turned harder ground than that with patience before, and there was, as it fell out, one boat at the crossing that was not the ferry at all. The boat that was not the ferry was Ambrose Teal's. Old Teal had come to the crossing with Elihu Bishop in the beginning and stayed on the way a snag stays in a river, and years back he had knocked together a little flat-bottomed skiff to run his trot lines and gather driftwood off the eddies, and it was his by the only law that counted at the crossing, which was that everyone said so. It would carry 2 men and a load of wood, and Teal kept it pulled up under the willows below the landing. Marguerite had been feeding old Teal soft food all spring, mashing his beans and grinding his coffee twice fine because his teeth were near gone, and she had done it without once letting the other men notice, and Ambrose Teal knew to the ounce what was owed and to whom. When she asked him on a Saturday night for the loan of his skiff and a Sunday's worth of his back, he studied her through his pipe smoke for the space of 3 breaths and said that his own grandfather had run a horse boat on the Ohio before the war, and that he had always half suspected there was more to a rope ferry than Elihu let on, and that the skiff was hers till Monday. What happened on the river that Sunday became, in the after years, one of the tales the town of Ferristown told about itself, and like all such tales it grew grander with the telling, until the still June water was a raging flood and half the county lined the banks to watch. The truth was 5 people: Marguerite, old Teal, the girl Delia bailing and holding lines until her arms shook, Duff Hooley, who had laid over and stayed to see the show, and from mid-afternoon, leaning on the landing rail with their hats tipped down as though they had only happened to pause there on the way to somewhere, President Bishop and a young freighter named Cleve Artis who tended the far bank. She did nothing that looked like anything. That was what Duff Hooley said after, baffled and won over. She had Teal and Artis carry a light line up the near bank and make it fast to a stout live cottonwood a good way above the landing, high well up the slope, and run it down across to a low stump on the far side. and to that borrowed line she rigged the little skiff on a bridle of her father's tarred marline, set at an angle to the current she judged by eye and by the feel of the water on her hand. Then she stepped the skiff off the bank into the June River, with only the girl aboard to bail, took no oar at all, and set the bridle. And the Sweetwater took the angled boat on its shoulder and carried it across the whole width of the river to the far landing, without a stroke pulled or a pole set, sliding on the current like a bead on a string, and stepped it back again the same way, over and over, the river doing every ounce of the work for nothing while the men stood with their mouths open. Hooley came off the rail. It could not be that easy, he said, half angry. A ferry a man did not have to fight. Marguerite did not argue. She brought the skiff in and made it fast, and told him it was that easy on any river God ever ran downhill. If a body hung the rope so the water pushed the boat where it wanted to go instead of where it did not, and that the reason his loaded wagons could not cross sundown at high water was that Elihu Bishop, rest him, had hung his rope to fight the flood instead of ride it, and had trimmed his boat by the stern so it drank the river bow first, and that a ferry hung and trimmed right grew safer as the river rose, not deadlier, because the stronger the current, the harder it worked for you. And then she had them wade the shallows, and she showed them the ferry's own rope where it sagged rotten at midstream, and the snubbing post punky at the ground. And she took her father's marlinspike and opened the tired strands a finger's width, so even Duff Hooley could see the daylight in a rope that was one hard freshet from parting under a loaded team. Even the men who had crossed that boat 1,000 times went quiet over it. Present Bishop crouched at the leaning post and worked his thumbnail into the soft wood at the base, and it went in to the first knuckle, like the wood was cheese. And he stood up slow and looked out at the ferry riding on that rope with a load of nails aboard from the morning's crossing, and did not speak for a while. Old Teal put his hand flat on the borrowed line the girl had ferried on all afternoon, still humming with the river, and said wonderingly that it was alive, that a rope hung right was a live thing, and a rope hung wrong was a dead one waiting to kill you. And he could not have said before that day which he had been walking across for 20 years. The girl Delia, wet to the waist and shining, said the crossing on the live rope had felt like flying, and that was the word that went around the wagon yard for a month. The Frenchwoman's ferry that flies. Marguerite tied her apron and went up to see to supper, because it was Sunday and the cruise ate at 7, and she had learned long ago that the strongest thing a woman could say in a moment like that was nothing at all. It was Present who followed her up to the kitchen. He stood in the door turning his hat, and he asked her straight out who she was. Not unkindly. A man watching the ground move under his own crossing wants to know what is moving it. So she told him, standing at the range with her back half to him, in the level voice of a woman handling an old wound with clean hands. The ferry parishes on the great river below the falls where her people had kept crossings and run rope ferries and pulled drowned men out of eddies for 4 generations, back to the French time, and where a ferryman's rope craft was a trade handed father to child like a name. Her father, master of a big cable ferry at a bad reach of the great river, a man with no living sons, who had carried his daughter onto the water on his back before she could walk and taught her the river as other men teach their children the alphabet, splicing, serving, hanging, trimming, reading a current for the rock and the snag under it, and had been dead now 9 years, drowned pulling a stranger's overturned skiff to shore in a March freshet, which was the death he would have chosen had anyone thought to ask him. A husband, Bertrand Fontaine, a good steady riverman from the next parish down, who had brought her west in '78, because the great river was going to steamboats and railroad bridges, and there was no more living in a rope ferry back home, and they had run a small horse ferry on the Missouri 2 years until a railroad bridge killed it, and started overland for a crossing in the Kansas country a man had written them of. And on the trail the winter fever had taken Bertrand Fontaine in 9 days, and put him under sod she could not find again now if she went looking. For the prairie moves its grass. 8 years she had cooked and washed and mended across Kansas and Nebraska and the Territory. A widow with a riverman's trade nobody would let a woman practice, and when she read in a Cheyenne paper a notice from a river crossing wanting a keeper, she had understood it the way a hand understands a warm rail on a cold night. She had answered the notice for the reason a boat swings to the current, not for him, not even for the wages, because it was moving water, and she was for moving water, and there was no other way left in this world for her to stand next to her own life. Present Bishop heard the whole of it without moving, and when it was done he did not say he was sorry, or that it was a wonder, or any of the things that would have been only wind. He asked her what was wrong with his crossing, all of it in order, and Marguerite took the beans off the fire so they would not scorch, and sat down across the table from him and told him. And somewhere in the middle of the telling he got up and fetched paper and his inkstand, and began to write the points down, numbered, in his careful bookkeeper's hand. And if a body wanted to fix the hour the bishop crossing began to be saved, it was that one. A widower and a widow, and a pot of beans and a list. The changes went in through July and August, and they went in slow, with argument, because caution was the whole religion of the place and it had earned the right to be. They set new snubbing posts, green cedar hauled from the canyon and budded deep and braced, and Present hung the rope her way, high on the upstream cottonwood and low to the far stump, and reset the traveler blocks, and Marguerite herself served the whole midstream span fresh with new marline over a heart of tarred yarn, her father's long splice where the two ends met, a splice so smooth and strong that Duff Hooley ran his hand over it and said he could not find where the join was, and that no wire cable off the Denver Bridge was laid any handsomer. They shifted the ballast forward and trimmed the boat to ride bow high, and the first loaded wagon that crossed the new hung ferry crossed with the river running a good 4 feet up in the melt, and it crossed dry and easy and quick, the current swinging it over, and the freighter, a hard old article named Pettibone, who had not paid a bishop toll in 2 years on principle, stood on the far landing and took off his hat to the boat. Word of that hat went up and down the wagon road faster than the freight ever did. The Bishop Ferry runs in high water now. The Bishop Ferry runs in high water. It was the one thing the crossing had needed to say for 2 years and could not. And now it set itself in every wagon camp from the railhead to the mines, and the wagons that had learned the road to the toll bridge began, some of them, to unlearn it. What came out of that, in the 3rd week of August, was Simon Record. Record ran the bank and had carried the crossing's note 2 years out of a hard fairness, and had written twice that he could not carry it again, and he drove out to sundown himself on a Thursday, which bankers did not do, and stood on the landing and watched a loaded ore wagon ferry across the risen river, slick as an egg off a spoon. And he watched the next one, and he took out a little book and made a figure in it, and he asked Present, careful, how many wagons the crossing was turning now against the spring. And Present told him, and Record made another figure. And then he said the thing that a banker says when the arithmetic has changed under him, which was that he would want to look at the October note again in September. There being, he said, developments. That was as near to hope as the crossing had come in 2 years. and it should have been the turn of the whole thing, and it would have been, but for the letter that came down on the next freight but one, in the first week of September, and landed the harder for all the hope around it. It was from the office of the Territorial Road Commissioners at Cheyenne, and it was courteous, and it was a knife. The commissioners gave notice that the crossing's ferry license, granted to Elihu Bishop in 1866 and renewed by grace each year since, was under review. Upon a formal complaint lodged with the board that the Bishop Ferry was operated in an unsafe condition, its rope and works decayed past prudence, endangering the traveling public, and that unless the crossing could show cause at a hearing in Ferristown on the 15th day of October, the license would be revoked and the crossing closed, the public safety being served, so the letter said, by the sound iron bridge already established 10 miles below at the Ferristown Narrows. Present read the letter out at the kitchen table by the light of one lamp, and the room went still. A revoked license was not a debt you could pay or a rope you could splice. It was the crossing's throat cut clean. And the charge was a lie turned inside out. For the ferry stood safer that September than it had stood in 10 years. The new posts sound, the rope new served. The boat crossing loaded teams in high water it had not dared touch in living memory. And the one man in the territory who had certified it unsafe, whoever had lodged that complaint, had lodged it in the very month the thing became untrue. Marguerite sat looking at the letter in the lamplight, at the two jaws of the trap closing from two directions at once, the note from one side, and now the license from the other. And away out in the dark the river ran on past the landing the way it had run for 10,000 years, minding nobody's troubles, and Marguerite Fontaine raised her head slow, and looked toward the sound of it, and began at last to think like her father's daughter about the whole of Sundown Crossing, and not merely its rope. She took the two jaws one at a time, and she took the strange one first, because a hidden hand frightens men worse than a plain debt, and frightened men decide badly. Who had lodged the complaint? The letter did not say, the board keeping the complainant's name in confidence until the hearing, but there were only so many hands in that country that stood to gain by the closing of the Bishop crossing. And when Marguerite set the road commissioner's letter beside the memory of a warm handshake on a Ferristown boardwalk, the arithmetic ran only one way. Josiah Vane, Vane of the Bridge and Transfer Company, who owned a piece of the Denver toll bridge downriver and freighted for it and forwarded for it, and made $1 on every wagon that crossed it, and who had told her with his warm smile that near everything in that country moved through his hands, and who stood to make that boast true entire if the last free-running ferry above his bridge were closed by. Law for the public safety. When Marguerite laid it out at the table, Present pushed back and walked the room, and said a man did not accuse the county's biggest freighter and a director of the bridge company on a keeper's guesswork, and that Vane had shaken his father's hand and stood at his father's grave. Marguerite did not press. She had not been raised to win arguments. She had been raised to read water and to let the reading speak. She asked only this, that they say nothing to anyone, that they let the season run out quiet, and that in the meantime she be allowed to keep, in her own book, the crossing's tally, every wagon, every toll, every night's roadhouse trade, dated and witnessed by old Teal's mark, from that week forward. It cost nothing. Even Present could not argue against a tally book. He agreed, unhappy, and did not ask what she meant a book of honest crossings to catch, and she did not say, because what she meant it to catch was not the hidden hand at all. A tally book does not catch a schemer. It builds the one thing that wins a license hearing, which is a wall of plain dated fact that a smooth man's word breaks against, and either it would be needed on the 15th of October, or it would not, and either way it cost only ink. The hidden hand would answer to the hearing itself, and to the crossing's own works, and to a river running high on the day the commissioners came to look. What made the tally book worth its ink was that it bought her September. And September was already spoken for, because the second jaw of the trap was the note and the hearing, both coming due within a fortnight of each other. And against both she had been carrying an answer since her first month at the crossing, carrying it like a thing too big to set down in a small room, and the time had come to set it down. She asked present for a Sunday and the loan of the mule, and she rode the whole reach of the river, up the canyon above the crossing and down toward the Narrows, with her father's compass and a sounding line in the saddlebag, and the girl, who could no more be kept from her now than her own shadow, riding a borrowed pony alongside. What she was reading all that long bright day was the river itself, its reaches and its rocks and its landings, the way a ferryman reads a river for what it will give and what it will take. The crossing at sundown gave her a fright first. She sounded the channel below the ferry and found it filling. A great tongue of gravel and cobble carried down by two springs of unchecked freshet building a bar across the lower landing where the boat came in, so that in another year or two of neglect the far landing would silt up and shoal, and the finest natural crossing for 20 miles would drown itself in its own gravel. Unwatched, the way the spring had silted and the rope had rotted, everything at sundown dying the same death of a keeper who did not know what he was keeping. That was the fright. The gift came at the day's far end, a mile up the canyon, where the girl, throwing stones at the water in the manner of children, called out that the river went narrow and slow between two shoulders of red rock. It was more than narrow. In a bend a mile above the crossing, the whole Sweetwater drew itself in between two ledges of solid stone, no more than 60 feet apart, deep and steady and slow, with rock banks a wagon could stand on, and a rock floor a pier could sit on. The one place in all that reach where a man might someday throw across not a rope, but a cheap timber bridge, a private bridge, a free bridge on ground the crossing already owned, above the toll bridge and its $1.25, a thing that would end the shadow of the Denver Bridge over sundown forever. She sat the mule along while looking at those two red ledges, and looking at the girl, and told her she had earned her penny for the month twice over. And Delia Bishop, who understood not one figure of it, understood Marguerite's face perfectly, and sent the pony down the canyon at a dead run, whooping like a curlew. That evening after supper she cleared the table and asked Present and Old Teal and young Cleve Artist to sit, and she laid it all out plain, the way her father had laid a thing before the parish, the need first, the means second, the cost last. The crossing could not live forever on 75 cents a wagon against a bank note and a bridge company and a road commission that could close it with a letter, she said, so long as the whole living hung from one aging rope ferry that the law could always call unsafe. But nobody at the Denver Bridge and nobody at the road commission had reckoned with the one thing Sundown Crossing owned that no toll bridge could take from it, which was the ground at the Narrows a mile up. The two red ledges 60 feet apart, deep water, rock banks, rock floor. The cheapest bridge site in the county sitting idle on land, the crossing already held under Elihu's old patent. Build a plain timber truss across that gap, she said, a thing two good men and a season could raise out of canyon cedar and freighted iron, and the crossing would have what the Denver Company had and would have it above them, and would charge half their toll and keep every wagon on the range, and the ferry would run on beside it for the light traffic and the high water, and no road commissioner alive could close a sound-covered bridge on the public safety. She laid her small book open on the table with the figures, the timber, the iron, the days, the labor, and pushed it into the middle, and sat back and let the reading speak. The silence went on a while. It was old Teal who spoke first, and what he said was that he had been ferrying men across that river for 20 years to save them a wedding, and it was high time somebody kept them dry for good. But young Artis shook his head, and his objection was the true one, the one she could not answer with figures, and to his credit he said it to her face and not to the yard. It would cost, by her own book, $400 and more in iron and freight and hired time. The crossing did not have 40. The note came due the 1st of October, the license hearing came the 15th, and if the bridge failed, if the span racked or the piers scoured in the first freshet, or any one of 100 things went wrong that go wrong with a thing never tried before in that country, the crossing would die owing more than ever, and the men would go unpaid into the winter. And that, said Cleve Artis, was a mighty lot to stake on a rope woman's say-so. He was not wrong. That was the misery of it. He was a good hand saying a true thing, and she had no answer, because it was not her $400, and it was not her father's crossing on the block. Everyone at that table knew where the choosing lived. Present Bishop sat looking at her book a long time. Then he got up without a word and went out, and they heard the mule taken from the stable, and he was gone 2 days, and the crossing ground on and nobody spoke of it, and Marguerite cooked and did not sleep much. What he did in those 2 days he told her only afterward, and some of it she had from others years later. He rode down to the Narrows and stood on the Denver toll bridge and paid his $1.25 to cross his own river, and watched Vane's forwarding wagons roll over it and counted them. He rode up to the cemetery on the hill above Ferristown where Susanna and the baby were, and what passed there was his. And he rode back by way of the bank and sat an hour with Simon Record, not to borrow, for there was no borrowing left, but to ask the question he had been too proud to ask in 2 years, which was exactly how long, to the day, the crossing had. And then he came back out to sundown in the cold September dusk and stabled the mule himself and walked into the kitchen where she was banking the range and stood turning his hat and said that he had sold the freight team, Elihu's big Percheron team, the last thing of any real price the crossing owned that was not the ferry itself. 4 gray horses a Cheyenne stage line would take for $260 sight unseen. And Susanna's silver, freighted west when they married and packed away in the chest 2 years now, would bring another 100 at the assay office, and his father's gold watch and the second wagon the rest, and he had done the sums riding home, and the sums came to 430. He said it flat, in the voice he kept for costly things. And then he said the other thing. The thing she remembered after all the rest of that year had gone soft, standing in the middle of her kitchen with the hat brim going round and round in his 2 hands. He said he had spent 2 years learning to lose the crossing slow, and had got good at it, and was done being good at it. He said his father had built the place out of nothing but nerve, and had been half wrong about all of it, and it had lived anyway, because the old man bet, and the betting had died with him, and Present had spent 2 years being the careful son at the careful end of the bank's book, and had learned there was nobody in this world going to lend a careful man a dime. He said he did not understand ropes and did not need to, because he had spent 5 months watching her be right while other folks were only loud, and a man who would not stake that had no business calling himself unlucky. He was only blind. And then he set his hat down on her table, which he had never once done, and asked her to show him where to put the piers. The bridge went up through the last of September and into October, through the first hard frosts, with every hand at the crossing and 6 hired men from town at day wages. And half of Ferristown found a reason to drive the 3 miles up and watch. The Narrows were made for it, just as she had said, the red ledges taking the cedar sills like they had been cut for them. And Marguerite laid out the truss herself off her father's rules with a chalk line and a plumb bob, and old Teal, who could still swing an adze true, dressed the timbers, and the span crept out across the deep green water ledge by ledge, and the wagons on the road slowed their teams to gape at it. She built it the way her people built a thing meant to outlast the builder, no faster than it could be built right, checking every joint and every pin with her hands before she let a man weight it. And when a hired carpenter from town wanted to hurry the last bay, she took him down to the water and showed him the drift marks on the ledges from the year of the big flood, higher than a man's head, and told him plain that the river they were building over was not the river he saw that mild October day, and that a bridge built for a low river was a coffin waiting on a high one. And the carpenter, who had meant to teach the Frenchwoman a thing about carpentry, went back up the ledge and pinned the bay her way. Present worked beside the hired men the whole 3 weeks, and it did him good in a way the money never could have. For a man mending a thing with his own hands cannot brood on losing it, and Marguerite watched the stoop come out of his shoulders board by board. On the 6th of October they keyed the last truss and drove the first empty wagon across the plain cedar deck of the sundown bridge, and the river ran deep and green and slow beneath it, and the bridge did not so much as tremble, and Delia Bishop ran across it and back 3 times for the pure joy of crossing her own river-dry shod for nothing. And on the 8th of October, with the note falling due on the first already carried, Simon Record, having looked at the crossing again and seen a toll bridge where 2 years of letters had promised him only a drowning man, and carried the note to Spring on the strength of it, the crossing turned to the last and worst of it, the thing the tally book had been quietly filling against all season, the matter of Josiah Vane, and the complaint no one would own, and the license hearing that would keep the crossing open or close it forever at the Ferristown Courthouse on the 15th day of October. The plan for the 15th was Marguerite's in its bones and Present's in its manners, and it was plain, because she did not trust Clever and he could not afford it. The crossing would not go to the hearing to accuse anyone of anything. It would go to answer the charge that the ferry was unsafe, and it would answer it with the ferry itself. Present would ask the commissioners, respectfully, to hold no part of the hearing in the courthouse until they had first come the 3 miles out to Sundown and looked and crossed. And when they came, they would find the new hung ferry crossing a loaded wagon across a risen October river, quick and dry and easy, on a rope new served with a splice a cable master would envy, off green posts set deep, and beside it, a mile up the canyon, a sound timber bridge on solid rock that made the whole complaint an absurdity. For what public safety was served by closing a crossing that had just built the public a free bridge? And Marguerite's tally book would lie open on the table. Every dated crossing since September, every loaded team the ferry had carried safe in high water, witnessed by old Teal's mark, a plain wall of fact. No accusation would be made at all. That was the manners of it, and the manners were present to the marrow. He would not stand up in a courthouse and name his father's friend a liar and a schemer before the county. He would only build the bridge, and hang the rope, and open the book, and let the works and the water and the tally argue, and let the commissioners do the arithmetic themselves. For men who sit on a board can be relied upon to do arithmetic. Marguerite wrote the letter to the commissioners at his asking, for her hand was the better one, a plain letter over his signature, inviting the board to inspect the crossing and its new bridge before the hearing, and to cross the ferry themselves with a loaded wagon, high water or low, the crossing having, the letter said, some improvements to show that the complaint had not accounted for. Nothing more. She sanded it, and he read it twice and signed it, and looked up at her across the small light of the lamp, and said that his father would have ridden into Vane's office and knocked him down, and been in the wrong and in the jail by supper, and lost the license for good. His father, he said, had bet grand and roared when he lost, and everyone had loved him for it and lent him more, and that credit had died with him, and it had taken present 2 years of being the quiet man at the quiet end of the bank's book to see that no one was ever going to lend him roaring. She said that they lent him nothing for quiet. Either, no, he said. They did not, and it was the nearest either of them came, all that fall, to saying the thing that was by then plainly true, that the crossing was being saved by the 2 kinds of patience in that kitchen, and that neither kind had ever been loved out loud in the country they lived in. The flood came on the 12th, and it near took the whole of it. A warm rain came up the basin on a south wind and sat over the mountains 3 days and put the melt down all at once, and the sweet water rose overnight higher than the old men had seen it since the year of the big water, brown and roaring and full of trees, and the crossing turned out in the dark to save what could be saved. The ferry rode it like a gull, the new hung rope singing high and taut, and the angled boat holding easy in a current that would have rolled the old level rig under in an hour. And Marguerite stood on the landing in the rain and watched her father's rope craft hold the river, and was not afraid for the ferry at all. It was the bridge she feared. A whole cottonwood came down on the flood in the black hour after midnight and drove into the upstream pier of the new bridge and hung there, and the water piled against it, and the pier began to work. It was Delia who heard it first, the deep grinding of the timber under the roar, because the child slept toward the river the way other children sleep toward a hall light, and she came pounding on the Roadhouse door in her nightgown, and they all went up the canyon into the wet dark with lanterns. They fought for the pier until dawn. All of them, the men. Present. Marguerite in a borrowed oilskin with her skirts knotted up, working out along the straining span with pike poles to break the drift tree loose before it took the pier out, and it was ugly, deafening, sightless work in a horizontal rain. By lantern light the wind kept killing, and twice the pier shuddered and thought about going, and was saved by Present and old Teal bracing the shoreside sill with green timber while the young men speared at the tree. When at last it broke loose and rolled off downstream into the dark, and the pier stood, strained and braced and standing, the crew went in and dropped where they fell. Marguerite could not sleep. She built up the kitchen range and set the big pot on for the men's waking, and found she was shaking, not with cold, and was still standing over the fire shaking when Present came in out of the gray first light with both hands raw from the pike pole, looking for hot water, and found her, and for once in his careful life did not stop to reckon the cost of anything, and put his arms around her, and she let him, and the pot boiled over behind them unminded, a wastefulness neither of them named. It was not a scene such as the story papers print. They were both past 40, soaked to the skin, river mud to the elbows, shaking with spent fear over a pile of cedar timber that was all that stood between the crossing and the winter, and they held on to one another in a kitchen that smelled of wet wool and wood smoke. And what he said, when he said anything at all, he said into her wet hair. Rough, like a man paying out a truth on a line he could not stop running. He said he had to be square with her. He said he was still afraid, that some mornings he still woke with Susanna's name in his mouth and a black quarter hour where the whole day looked like wading a river with the water rising, and that he had decided, 2 years back, that wanting anything again was a debt he would never take up twice. He said the crossing could wash away for all he cared. Crossings could be built again, but that he had watched her walk out onto a straining bridge in a flood for his father's ground. And somewhere out there in the dark, spearing at a tree beside her, he had run clean out of smaller names for what he felt. He was not offering her a hired woman's place in a saved crossing, he said, and he was not fool enough to offer her a rescue, for she was the one doing the rescuing, and every soul in the county knew it. What he was asking, if she would hear it, was for Marguerite Fontaine to marry present Bishop, and he would have the partnership papers drawn the same week in Ferristown, her name beside his on the crossing itself, half of Sundown, the ferry, the bridge, the roadhouse, the note, and the daylight, because he would not have a wife who was owed and unnamed. He had seen what the world did with unnamed women who built things. It had taken her whole life to teach him, and he had finally learned it. He said all of it badly, in pieces, with long stops, and she stood in the circle of his arms and heard the pieces come in like sacks off a wagon. Weight after weight after weight, true weight, full weight, nothing shorted. And when he was done, she was quiet so long that she felt him begin, in his chest, to brace. What she said first was that she was afraid, too, that she had put one good man under grass she could not find, and had promised herself on that ground she would never again love a thing this country could take from her, and had kept that promise 8 years by loving nothing but a trade folded in oilcloth at the bottom of a chest, and that he had ruined the whole promise by handing her a rotten rope and a still Sunday. What she said second was a question, and she drew back far enough to watch his face take it, because she had been shorted before by kind men who never knew they were doing it, and she needed the weighing done in the light. She asked whether, if the license were lost on the 15th, if the board closed the crossing and there was no ferry and no bridge and no partnership paper and nothing to her name but a chest and a compass, the asking still stood. And present Bishop, who did nothing quickly, answered that one before it was all the way out of her mouth. The asking stood, he said. The asking had been standing since August, waiting on his nerve, and it would stand on a closed crossing with the boat hauled out and the road gone quiet. And if she wanted him to prove it, he would let the whole thing go to the board this day, and hire out driving freight over Vane's own bridge, and be a poor man's husband, and be richer than he stood right now, mud to the elbows and unanswered in his own kitchen. And at last she laughed, the second laugh anyone at the crossing had heard from her, and said no, he would not let it go, that they had not held the bridge against the flood 4 hours since to hand the river back to the toll company, and that her answer was yes, and had been yes longer than she meant to own to a man whose nerve took 5 months, and that he should sit down now and let her see to his hands, which were bleeding into her clean floor. The girl was told the next evening, the two of them sitting her down at the long table with a gravity that scared her badly until the words were out. And then Delia Bishop looked from her father to Marguerite and back with an expression of vast and injured patience, and said that she had known since the ferry that flies, that the whole crossing had known, that Cleve Artis had lost 2 bits to Old Teal over whether it would come before the first snow, and might she be excused, because the pony wanted feeding. At the door she stopped, the way she had stopped on the kitchen step in the spring, with the song about her mother balanced on her whole small body, and she asked, not quite looking up, what she was to call Marguerite after. Marguerite considered the question with the weight it had been asked with, and said that her mother was her mother, and would stay so, that no one would ever be asked to unsay that name, and that she might call her Marguerite as the men did, or Mammon if ever the day came when it said itself, and that either way she meant to go on paying a penny for strung beans, wedding or no wedding, for she was not made of money. The child nodded once, judicially, satisfied on every point that mattered, and went out to her pony. And it took until the following spring, on no particular evening over no particular supper, for the day to come when it said itself. And when it did, Marguerite passed her the molasses jug without a word, and hummed 2 bars of the old rowing song. And that was the whole ceremony of it, and no grander one was wanted. So the 15th of October found them what they were: promised, unwed, half broke, and standing on the landing at sundown in a cold, bright wind, while 3 road commissioners of the territory, and Simon Record for the bank, and a courthouse clerk with a satchel, and Josiah Vane in his fine drab coat, come out to see his complaint carried. All stood on the near bank and watched Cleve Artis ferry a fully loaded 4-horse ore wagon across a river still running high and brown from the flood, quick and dry and dead easy, the current swinging it over on the new hung rope, while the splice ran through the traveler blocks smooth as silk. The chief commissioner, a spare dry man named Alonzo Frame, watched the crossing without a word, and then asked to be taken across himself, and was standing in the wagon bed with his hat in his hand, and came back looking at the rope. Then Present took them the mile up the canyon and showed them the bridge, sound and level on its braced piers, the drift scar still fresh on the upstream pier where the flood tree had struck 3 nights gone and not moved it. And Alonzo Frame walked the deck and looked over the rail at the deep green water, and asked of no one in particular what public safety was served by closing a ferry that had built the public a bridge. And back at the Roadhouse table, Marguerite's tally book lay open, every dated crossing since September, every loaded team carried safe in the high water, witnessed in old Teal's careful mark. And Frame turned the pages slow, September into October, the flood days and all, and set the book down and looked a long moment at Josiah Vane, who had lodged. The board's own papers now showed on the courthouse clerk's reading the complaint of unsafe condition, dated the very week the crossing had begun hanging its new rope. Nobody said the word. That was the wonder of it, the thing the courthouse men told longest after, that in a full hour of works and water and a tally book, with a man's whole reputation lying open on a roadhouse table, no soul said the word liar or the word scheme, because no soul had to. A board can be relied upon to do arithmetic. Alonzo Frame stood a while with his knuckles on the table, and what he was reading there, besides the false complaint, was his own board's near miss. A year of a paper complaint aimed to close by law the one free crossing standing between a whole cattle range and a Denver toll company's $1.25, and how near the board had come to being the toll company's hired hand without knowing it. Frame was reckoned a hard man in the county's opinion, but the county's opinion had it wrong, said Marguerite ever after. He was an exact man, and exactness keeps a conscience that hard men lack. He straightened up, and he said it in front of his own 2 fellow commissioners, and the bank, and the clerk, and Vane himself. And this is the sentence as old Teal carried it home, word for word, like a man carrying a brimful cup. I came out here, Frame said, on a paper that told me this crossing was a danger to the traveling public, and I have crossed it loaded in high water, and I have walked its bridge. And I will say to the board and to this company and to whoever cares to hear it, that the paper was a lie, that this is the soundest crossing in the territory, and that I am told the works were hung by a woman, and I mean to shake her hand before I leave, for I would license her ferry over any bridge the good Lord ever let a company build. The license was renewed on the spot and endorsed, and the board went further, for exactness has its own momentum, and struck a note into its record that the crossing had been the object of a complaint it now found to be without merit and made in bad faith, and that word, in the board's own record, was the thing that finished it. As for Josiah Vane, no charge was ever laid, for the sufficient reason that a complaint made in bad faith is a hard thing to hang a man for, and the crossing had no appetite to try. But the 15th of October has a voice in a small county, and by Christmas the story of the road commissioner who crossed the flood and shook the Frenchwoman's hand had gone up and down the range, and the free sundown bridge at half the toll had turned the freight back to the crossing wholesale, and Vane's Denver Bridge stood most days with the wind blowing across an empty deck, and the bridge company, seeing the arithmetic itself now, sold Vane's forwarding contract out from under him within the year, and he moved down to the railhead to broker cattle for other men, and Ferristown, which does not forgive a thing quietly attempted quietly, never asked him back, and that was the whole of his fate, and it was enough. Simon Record carried the note to Spring, and it was paid out of the winter's crossing money, principal and interest entire, and paid early, and the crossing came into the new year owing no man $1 for the first time since Elihu Bishop was thrown from the green horse. Duff Hooley's concession came last, as was right, and it came in his own coin. On the morning of the wedding, which was the second Sunday of November, in the little church at Ferristown with the whole crossing scrubbed and standing in the front pews, and Hannah weeping frankly, and the girl, Delia, in a collar that was slowly throttling her, Hooley turned up at the Roadhouse door in his one good coat, while Marguerite was still in her apron, and he took his hat all the way off, and he said that he had said, back in April, on that porch where she had likely heard it, that she would be gone on the next train up. He said he had freighted that road 18 years and had been wrong in his time about weather, mules, Fords, and men, but never so wrong about anything as about what stepped off the down train that Thursday, and that he had watched her save the ferry, the bridge, the license, the note, the girl, and the man, and he counted them off on his fingers like freight on a manifest. And he said that where he came from, when a man had eaten as much crow as he had eaten that year, he asked for the honor of driving the bride to the church, and she gave him the honor, and rode to her wedding on a freight wagon, washed and ribboned, beside a freight boss in his good coat, over the new bridge and down the 3 cold bright miles to town. And if there is a prouder way for a ferryman's daughter to travel to her wedding, it has not yet been discovered. They were married at 11 and home by 3, for a river crossing keeps no Sabbath entire, and there was a supper at the Roadhouse that night for the whole crew, and the men had, in secret by way of Hannah Loy's counter, gotten the one gift there was to get. It was a signboard, sign painted in Cheyenne, gold letters on green, to hang over the road at the near landing where the old splitboard had said Bishop Ferry since 1866. The new one said Bishop and Bishop, Ferry and Bridge. And when they had hung it, and the crew had made the noise crews make, and the November dusk came down violet over the whole reach of the river, with the ferry rope singing soft in the wind, and the bridge standing black and sound a mile up the canyon against the first stars, Present asked her, quiet, under the noise, how she had known, back in the black of the spring, when every figure in the ledger said the crossing was dead, that there was anything here to save. And Marguerite Bishop looked out at the river a long moment, at the water doing its old free work in the dark, and gave him the answer her father had given the parish the year the great river took the ferry and they built it again. The sentence she had carried across a country and the wreck of a life, the only inheritance that had made the whole crossing over whole. A river is not your enemy, she said. It only wants to carry you. Most folks just never learn to let it. And she went in to see to the supper, because the crews ate at 7. And she was the keeper, and she was the crossing, and there had never been a Sunday in her life when she could not be both at once. 5 years is nothing on a river and everything in a county, and by the summer of 1891, the wagon road that ran the 3 miles up from Ferristown to Sundown had been graded twice at county cost, because it carried too much trade to be left in ruts. The crossing kept 12 men the year round now and more at the spring freight rush. The Sundown Bridge had been redecked once and widened, and stood so sound and so plainly good that the territory itself had taken to sending its surveyors out to look at how the piers were braced against the melt, and travelers on the road slowed their teams to admire the neat truss over the green narrows, and drummers in the Ferristown Hotel argued over who had built it until some local man, with the studied carelessness of a fellow mentioning his county's wonder, would allow that the Frenchwoman up at Sundown had laid it out off her father's rules, and that the road commission itself had licensed her ferry over the Denver Company's bridge in front of God and the whole county the year the toll bridge began to die. The ferry ran on beside the bridge, as she had said it would, for the light quick traffic, and the horsemen and the high water, and the crossing took its tolls off both. And Old Teal kept the near landing, and Cleve Artist the far, and the Roadhouse was full most nights, and turned an honest profit that Marguerite entered in her own hand in the book that had once, upside down and by lamplight, taught her the whole shape of the trouble. The Sundown crossing became a thing the country was proud of, and the pride traveled, and once a year a letter came from a Cheyenne freighting house asking, with a warmth that grew, whether Bishop and Bishop had ever thought to bid the mail contract. The girl. Delia Bishop was 15 that summer and made her mother's old crossing in reverse each day, 3 miles down to the school at Ferristown and 3 miles back, over the bridge her family had built, on a stout dun horse bought with her own wages. For she drew a half share at the crossing now, earned, and Present said within her hearing that the girl could read the river for a rising better than most men could read it standing on the bank. But it was the other thing the girl could do that Marguerite minded. Evenings at the long table she spliced rope under the lamp with the marlinspike and the fid and the leather roll open beside her like a schoolmaster's rod, and she laid up a long splice at 15 as clean as Marguerite had laid one at 10. And there was no cause to mention it. And Marguerite mentioned it to no one, and knew exactly what she was looking at, which was the 5th generation of a rivercraft that the world kept swearing had ended. The ferry parishes to the Missouri, to a prairie grave, to a red canyon in Wyoming. The trade handed down the years like a splice, from a man with no sons, to a woman no one would hire, to a girl who had lost one mother and been claimed by another, over a jug of molasses and an old rowing song. Cleve Artist married the elder Loy girl and named his first daughter Marguerite, and was neither the first in the county to do it nor the last. And the crossing's little Marguerites grew up thinking it a common name and were startled, going out into the world to learn it belonged to one woman in a bend of Brown River above Ferristown. Old Ambrose Teal lived to 76, minding his near landing to the last spring, and was buried in the churchyard at Ferristown under a stone the crossing paid for. And at his own asking, the stone said only his name, his years, and the words he kept the landing. Duff Hooley never did learn to say a soft thing straight out, but every April, on the Thursday nearest the day the down train had come, there were always, by no hand anyone would own, wildflowers standing in a tin on the Roadhouse table, blue flax and Indian paintbrush, the canyon's own, and Marguerite never mentioned that either, and the two of them went on for years respecting one another in a fierce discreet silence, the whole crossing steered around like a channel marker. Present Bishop grayed early and easily, as stooped spare men do, and grew into one of those husbands the country turns out a few of each generation, who say little in a crowd and stand a half step behind their wives at a gathering with a look of contained and settled satisfaction, like a man who backed the right horse in the only race that ever mattered and draws his winnings every morning of his life. He kept the books, she kept the river, they kept each other, and once a year, on an anniversary no one else could have named, the 15th of October, the two of them drove down over their own bridge and onto Ferristown and back for no reason they gave, and dined at the hotel, and came home late under the fall stars, and what they said to each other on that road they never told. He was still afraid some mornings. She knew it as she knew weather coming up the basin, and on the black quarter-hour mornings she did not console him, for consolation was not a thing that reached the man. She set his coffee down and told him the day's one trouble, a frayed strand at midstream, a doubtful pier after a freshet, a toll to be argued with a stubborn freighter, and watched him take the trouble up the way another man takes up a line, hand over hand back into the daylight, and by 9 he would be down at the landing whistling. And if that is not what love is, it will serve until the true article is found. There were hard turns still, for a river does not retire. There was the winter the road closed under 6 feet of snow for 2 weeks, and the crossing ate its own stores down to the seed corn. There was the summer a cloudburst up the canyon sent a wall of water down that took out the far landing, and Marguerite rebuilt it in a week with her own splices while the men hauled rock. There was the year the cattle market broke, and the freight thinned, and the crossing leaned on the Roadhouse trade and the mail, and came through, leaner and unafraid. The debt never came back. The fear of the 1st of October never came back. What came instead, so slow that no one could name the year it arrived, was the thing Elihu Bishop had promised the country at the beginning, and had not lived to make good, and had needed a stranger off the down train to make good for him, which was that sundown became a crossing a whole range depended on and was glad of, its ferry and its free bridge carrying the freight of 3 counties, its roadhouse a warm light on a cold road, its name a byword for a place a wagon could always get across. For markets may break and mines may fail, but the river must still be crossed. And on a still evening in the fall of any of those years, a traveler coming up the graded road at dusk would see it the way Marguerite had seen it that first Black Thursday, and see it changed. The ferry rope singing soft, the reach going violet, the bridge standing sound over the green narrows, the roadhouse windows warm, the smell of wood smoke and supper, a tall graying man and a woman in an apron standing a moment together in the lighted door, counting their people in off the cold road. The river came down out of the dark canyon exactly as it had for 10,000 years before anyone wanted it crossed. The current took the angled boat on its shoulder and carried it over for nothing, asking no wages and no Sundays, the way she had taught it to be let do. What ran past the landing, brown and patient and strong, was never the crossing's enemy and never had been. It had only ever wanted to carry them. All that was ever wanting was somebody who knew how to let it. The rope sang low in the dark over the moving water. The lamp in the roadhouse burned. The kettle was on. And the crossing lay warm and living under the early stars, 3 miles up the river from Ferristown.